Hi everyone, my name is Michael Marshall and I'm a science writer. In this video I'm going to talk to you about one of the biggest mysteries in science. How did life begin on Earth? This is also the subject of my new book, The Genesis Quest, which is out now. When we ask how life began, we're asking where we came from. We're asking about our origins. And the question is also about how common life is in the universe and where else we might expect to find it. Today, there's life everywhere on Earth. Vultures have been seen flying at 11 kilometres above the ground. The deepest point of the ocean, the Challenger Deep, is over 10 kilometres deep, and yet there's life at the bottom. And you can even find single-celled microorganisms living 5 kilometres underground. But Earth is unique. The other 7 planets in the solar system don't seem to have life on them. Neither do any of the dozens of moons. If there is life on any of these worlds, like perhaps on Mars, there can't be that much of it, or we would have spotted it by now. Something about Earth is special. What's more, Earth wasn't always like this. When it formed 4.5 billion years ago, there was no life. We don't know exactly what Earth was like back then, but it wasn't welcoming. There were probably erupting volcanoes everywhere and huge meteorites crashing in from space all the time. But within 1 billion years, all that changed. The oldest confirmed evidence of life on Earth is 3.5 billion years old, and here it is. These are fossils from Australia of single-celled microorganisms that lived in thin layers or mats. So the implication is clear. Life emerged on our planet within the first billion years of its existence. The question is, how? The most famous explanation is that life formed in the so-called primordial soup. The idea is that when Earth was young, it was essentially a gigantic chemical factory, so lots of different carbon-based chemicals formed. Then, when the planet cooled enough for liquid water to exist, well, first of all, it absolutely bucketed down, and then the oceans formed. And all those carbon-based chemicals became dissolved in the water and formed a sort of concentrated liquid, a bit like soup. And in those thick, goopy oceans, the first simple living organisms emerged. This idea was actually put forward in the 1920s by a Russian scientist named Alexander Oparin, although he didn't come up with the soup metaphor. And it was the inspiration for the first real experiments into the origin of life, which were done in the 1950s. In those experiments, people tried to simulate conditions on the early Earth in the lab, and they showed that crucial chemicals of life like amino acids could form quite naturally and spontaneously. But there was a big problem with the idea that life began in the primordial soup. The issue is that the ocean is big, really big. You won't believe just how fantastically mind-bogglingly huge it is. And so the problem is that even if two of the key components of life manage to form in the ocean, they might never meet. They might be separated by hundreds of kilometers. There's also a lot more to the origin of life than simply making the chemicals of life. The chemicals have to work together in a lifelike way. Now, at this point, we have to step back a bit and think about what life actually is. It's a bit hard to define, but one thing that we do know is that all life today is based on cells. And cells are these microscopic bags or bubble-like structures which have an awful lot of intricate, complex machinery going on inside them. So everything from a whale to a single-celled bacterium is actually made of cells. So that leads us to the implication that if we want to understand how life began, what we're really asking is, how did the first simple version of a cell self-assemble on the young Earth? The good news is that there's now evidence that all of the key chemicals of life can be made from the same set of starter chemicals. Now, perhaps surprisingly, one of the best feedstock chemicals for doing this is a really simple but very poisonous chemical called cyanide. Despite the fact that it's poisonous, cyanide is also a very reactive chemical, which means it's very good at turning into different chemicals. So it's been shown in the last few decades that you can use cyanide to make everything from amino acids to the building blocks of DNA and to the lipids that form the outer membranes of cells. So that's good news number one. And the second thing that's emerged in the last few years is that when you start putting these chemicals together, they immediately start sticking together and protecting each other and working together. They seem to be favoured and almost shaped to do that. So when scientists do an experiment in which they only use one of the chemicals of life, say proteins, not an awful lot happens. But when you put two or more of them together, they immediately start behaving in much more complex and lifelike ways. So when we take these findings together, it implies that, in fact, the first simple cell might have self-assembled quite easily given the right conditions and raw materials. But finally, this does still leave us the question of where it happened. Many scientists nowadays don't think that life began in the sea for the reasons that we've talked about. Instead, they've started to suspect that life instead began in a much smaller body of water on land, something like a pool or a puddle. One of the most popular ideas is that life began in geothermal ponds. These are ponds that are found in volcanic areas, so the water is hot and it's rich in chemicals. And there are many experiments showing that, for example, the structures of cells can spontaneously self-assemble in the waters of those geothermal ponds, something that actually doesn't happen in seawater. There are still a lot of unanswered questions, and the scientists who study the origin of life don't all agree. But we've learned a lot in the last few years, and the discoveries are now coming thick and fast. It's quite possible that within my lifetime we'll see an experiment done in which a set of non-living chemicals self-assemble themselves into a simple living cell. In other words, we may one day be able to rerun Genesis. Thank you all so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this video and you'd like to learn more about how life might have begun and the scientists who are studying it, my book, The Genesis Quest, is available in all good bookshops. And please enjoy the rest of the Global Science Show.